The new growing season has started around here, with some of the first seeds being sown, at least for growing in the protected environment of the polytunnel. And as we head into the new cycle of growth in the gardens, I always find it interesting to look back at what happened last year and to reflect on some of the things that I learned in the process. While the explorations in the gardens were a really rich learning environment, I think the broader events of 2020 offered an exceptional opportunity to learn a wide range of different things, many of which we probably didn't want to learn. Over the years in the gardens, I've realized that many of the lessons learned while growing food are transferable in ways to other areas of my life. And a lot of what I learn about the broader world can help me to understand what is going on in the gardens a bit better. And 2020 was an exceptional year for this, and I thought I would share 12 of the many things that I learned last year that I've been thinking a lot about as we head into the new growing season. It is very useful to have a warm and bright space to propagate young plants for transplanting into the gardens, especially in the cool maritime climate of Ireland. And a few years ago, I built a plastic-covered propagation box with soil warming cables in the base to heat up the sand so the plants are sitting on. But a few people suggested that it could be easier and require less energy to add light to an already warm space than it is to heat up a brighter space outside. So I invested in a number of LED lights and created a stacked propagation area in an underused corner of our well-insulated house. This new space is warmer than the old space and a lot brighter, especially earlier on in the spring. So the young plants can grow faster, and because the LED lights are so energy efficient, it uses significantly less electricity and is more convenient for me to look after the seedlings. I still use the older heated propagation box for growing larger plants later in the spring, but I end up not using so much electricity to keep it warm. Because of the research nature of this Red Gardens project and the number of different gardens that I manage, planning and record keeping has always been important, but something that I haven't been so good at it in the past. But last year, I think I finally developed a system for detailing the planting plans for all the gardens in a spreadsheet in a way that I can fairly easily extract the appropriate details into a weekly task list. I can then refine details and incorporate all the harvest data and other observations into the same document while out in the gardens, all of which can then be easily compiled into a searchable spreadsheet that serves as a record for the full year. Or at least that's the plan. But it is something that I need to get right, as information and task management has been a time-consuming and cumbersome part of this project in the past. But so far, things are looking significantly better for this season. I have been taking soil tests within the gardens for a number of years, and I've been using them to carefully remineralize the soil in some of the gardens. And I'm becoming more convinced by these tests and the advice of people who have more experience than I do, that the typically low levels of sulfur that are found in the high pH calcareous soils that I work with is one of the key limiting factors of developing soil fertility. So I've been adding more sulfur to the soil on a regular basis with the aim of encouraging more balanced levels of the other main nutrients as well, and I suspect it may also be helping to build up the levels of soil organic matter, but that is something that I'm going to be keeping a close eye on over the next few years. I use a lot of plastic in the gardens, more than I would really like to. Some of this plastic I would consider to be very useful, if not essential, and other plastic materials I use because it makes managing the gardens a lot easier. But I've also brought in a lot of other plastic items into the gardens because I thought they would be appropriate materials to reuse, which would otherwise just go to the landfill or recycling. But these are the ones that I now realize I should probably avoid because they tend not to be UV stabilized and end up degrading too quickly. Perhaps the worst example has been the used polypropylene rope that I was able to get a load of and have used it to hang plants from in the polytunnel. But I've discovered that after a few seasons in the sunlight and heat, the rope started to shed a lot of fine strands or microplastics that ended up in the soil, so I won't be bringing any more of this rope into the gardens. Last year in my larger polytunnel, I used a strategy of relay intercropping to grow early crops that I could continue to harvest during the hunger gap of late spring and early summer, but to also get the main warm season crops into the ground early enough in the spring. This strategy of growing crops from two different seasons beside each other for a while did allow the seasons to blend or overlap, and I was able to significantly extend the harvests of a range of salad greens and other fast-growing root crops. But this intercropping approach did cause a noticeable impact on the growth of the younger tomato and cucumber transplants, which had to compete with some of the more established spring crops in adjacent rows. I still need to work out how best to use intercropping as a way to balance the trade-off between having an abundance of harvest during the hunger gap and maximizing the yield of the main warm season crops. Most of the vegetables that I grow do not need to be pollinated in the garden in order for there to be something to harvest. But a few types of plants are dependent on honeybees, bumblebees, or other insects to visit the flowers most days during the main part of the growing season. While I am fortunate to have honeybee hives right beside the gardens, and there is a strong population of different species of bumblebees in the surrounding landscape to help with this task, I have noticed times during the season when the flowers were not getting pollinated. As far as I can tell, these pollinators were attracted to more desirable flowers in the surrounding area and made fewer visits to the flowers that needed pollinating in my gardens in order for me to get a crop. This is a bit of a conundrum, as these pollinator-attracting plants are needed to support the population of pollinators, but they can also at times attract the same insects away from the flowers on my vegetable crops. I used to structure the planting plans of all the family-scale gardens around some form of 4-year crop rotation, with one of the main aims being avoiding the buildup of problematic diseases in the soil, especially clubroot, which can become a serious issue for many of the brassica family crops, including cabbages, cauliflower, and kale. But squeezing all of these crops into 1/4 of the garden places a significant limit on the amount of these crops that I can grow, even though they can be so productive and grow so well here in Ireland. But because I sow everything from seed and never import any plants, this significantly reduces the risk of importing the clubroot spores into the gardens, and apparently this disease is much less common in alkaline soils, and the calcareous soils that I grow in has a pH consistently above 7.5. So while there's still a risk of this disease building up in my soils, I have come to believe that it isn't enough to place crop rotation restrictions on how many brassica plants that I can grow, at least not in this context. One thing that I've learned over the years is that there's usually lots of different ways to do things in the gardens, and I often end up settling into a way of doing things that I think works well, at least until I get new information and options that prompts a change. An excellent example of this was when I described how I hang and drop tomato and cucumber plants when managing them in the relatively short space of one of my polytunnels. And a few people suggested that I look into using tomahawks as a way of managing tall plants. It is interesting that I hadn't known about the use of these bent pieces of wire before, but the idea seems to make a lot of sense, especially for large-scale growing spaces, so I'm going to give them a try next season. With most types of vegetables, there are a lot of possible varieties to choose from, and I've never really used any real logic or useful process in selecting the varieties that I end up buying for seed. And I really don't know if the varieties that I do select and use year after year are the best ones for my contexts and preferences. So I've started doing basic variety trials to see if there are better options out there. Last year, I possibly went a bit too far with this and ended up growing 54 different varieties of tomatoes in my larger polytunnel, taking up enough space to grow 2 plants of each variety. It was wonderful to be able to taste such a wide diversity of different tomatoes, but it was definitely a lot of extra work in organizing and keeping track of the useful information and data, and probably ended up being too much work on a busy and strange year. And last year was a very strange year, and I found that many of the things that I learned were not really related to the explorations in the gardens, but were more based on the events in the wider world around us. But as usual, there was a lot of parallels and potentially transferable lessons. One of the big things that I learned last year, or got definite confirmation of, was the extent to which building resilience really does matter. Building resilience has always been a big part of what I do, as well as for many other people in this small community here in the Midlands of Ireland. But until the events of last year, this resilience that we've been building has never really been tested. But as the world was locking down earlier in the year and supply chains were impacted, it was reassuring to already have lots of preserves in the cellar and freezer, lots of bulk food and other household goods in the pantry, and plenty of fresh vegetables in the gardens for ourselves and others around us. We thankfully also have friends and neighbors who continue to supply us with fresh, locally produced bread, milk, meat, and eggs, all delivered right to our door. There are lots of reasons why these local supply systems have been developed in our community, but it really contributed to our resilience and peace of mind last year, as we didn't need to go to the shops nearly as often, and we weren't reliant as much on the national and international supply systems that were really struggling. In addition to the global health crisis, we also had to deal with the uncertainty and eventual hassle of Brexit, when Ireland's closest trading partner decided to step away from the complex and mutually beneficial relationships that had been built up over decades. And while this was an interesting and really demoralizing process to watch, it has already had a direct impact on this Red Gardens project, as most of the seeds that I get are supplied by companies in the UK. All of these companies abruptly stopped shipping seeds to Ireland in December, and I've had to source alternate suppliers in Germany, at least until new arrangements are made with the UK or an appropriate Irish-based supplier emerges. I had the foresight to buy most of my seeds I needed for this year before all of this happened, and thankfully the supplier of seed potatoes that I rely on took the initiative and had the capacity to import all of the seed potatoes from Scotland before the end of the year. So I think I'm sorted for now, but I'm really concerned that a lot of people in Ireland aren't going to be able to find all of the seeds and supplies that they'll need for this growing season, and who knows what will happen for next year. In addition to everything else that was going on last year, my partner was diagnosed with cancer just as the first wave of the pandemic was starting here in Ireland. I ended up having second-hand experience of just how tough chemotherapy can be, and also how much of a relief it is to hear the words complete remission, even if the period of recovery goes on for much longer. My knowledge of the medical system here in Ireland used to be limited to reporting about overcrowding emergency rooms, lack of funding, and really long waiting lists. But this experience showed me that, at least within the cancer treatment part of it all, the medical system is really professional and works very well. And my partner was able to get all the scans and tests that were needed and was able to maintain full treatment right through a really problematic national and international health crisis, which was really impressive. I often hear about the problematic issues with other large systems or sectors of our society, and now I wonder how many of them work quite well in certain ways, but we only ever really hear about the really problematic parts of them all. So 2020 was quite the year, and I learned so many things in and around the gardens, and so many other things that are potentially transferable to my work exploring different ways of producing food. For example, it was really interesting to be able to gain a more nuanced understanding about the potential benefits of face coverings and masks. And I think this is a really interesting example about how conventional procedures and guidelines that are developed in one context, in this case the medical system, are not necessarily transferable to another context of the broader society of people going about their business. And this is something that I think about quite a bit when I look at exploring different techniques and methods in the gardens. I've also seen so many examples of how hard it can be for people to get around prejudices, preconceptions, and biases. And I think finding a way to facilitate this is a really important task, which I think is an essential part of this Red Gardens project, even though the context is very different. The world around us is rapidly changing, and this is very concerning in some ways, and also quite encouraging in other ways. And there's definitely lots to think about as we head into a new growing season. I don't know if there's ever been a better time to get out and grow food. And I feel that this is going to be a really good season for this Red Gardens project and this YouTube channel, as it seems that the work we're doing is more important than ever.